My name is Maren Kowalski. I'm 34 years old, and I've spent the last 6 years working as a product designer in Austin, Texas. I was sitting in the third row of a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of the Frost Bank Tower, watching my best friend of 11 years click through a slide deck built entirely from my work. Nestled was born from a simple question, Dana Whitfield said, her voice smooth as poured concrete. What if caring for aging parents didn't have to feel like a second job? I knew that line. I'd written that line. I'd written it at 11 at night on my kitchen counter, next to a mug of cold tea, thinking about my grandmother's last 2 years. The investors were nodding. One of them, a woman named Priscilla on from Larkspur Capital, was already typing notes into her phone. Dana clicked to the next slide. My wireframes. My color palette. My handwriting, badly redrawn by someone else, but still unmistakably mine. I sat perfectly still. I didn't gasp. I didn't stand up. I just opened my laptop, and I started pulling up files. Welcome back to Hidden Diaries, where we believe the loudest rooms don't always belong to the people who deserve them. If you've ever watched someone take credit for your work and had to decide whether to make a scene or make a plan, you already know where this one's going. Drop a comment if you've been here before, and subscribe if you want more stories like it. Let me back up, because you need to understand what Dana and I were to each other before you understand what she did. We met at the University of Texas, in a required statistics class neither of us wanted to take. I was a design student who couldn't stand numbers. Dana was a marketing major who couldn't stand silence. We ended up as lab partners because we were the only 2 people who showed up to the Friday morning discount section, and somewhere between complaining about our professor and splitting a $6 breakfast taco from a truck called Rosita's, we became friends. For 11 years, that friendship held its shape through almost everything. She stood next to me at my sister's wedding in a dress the color of dried sage, holding my shoes when I decided halfway through the reception that I couldn't dance in heels anymore. I sat with her in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning the night her father had his first stroke, drinking vending machine coffee that tasted like scorched cardboard, saying nothing useful because there was nothing useful to say, just being there. We celebrated each other's promotions. We cried at each other's breakups. When my engagement fell apart 4 years ago, Dana was the one who helped me pack up an apartment full of someone else's memories without asking me a single question I didn't want to answer. For most of our 20s, we lived 4 blocks apart in East Austin, close enough that coffee tomorrow could mean an actual walk instead of a calendar invite. Even after she and her husband, Grant, bought a house out in Circle C, a solid 40 minutes south on a good traffic day, we protected our standing ritual, every other Sunday morning at a coffee shop called Colleen's, a cramped, sun-warmed place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that never changed. We'd been doing that so long the owner knew our order before we sat down. Professionally, we ended up at the same company almost by accident, though looking back, I sometimes wonder if accident is generous. I'd been hired at Harlow Digital, a mid-sized product studio that built custom software for healthcare and eldercare companies, about 6 years ago, starting as a mid-level designer and working my way up to senior product designer within 3 years. 18 months after I joined, Dana mentioned she was job hunting, tired of the agency grind she'd been stuck in since graduation. I told her Harlow was hiring a marketing director. I put in a good word with our head of people ops. She interviewed twice, got the offer, and 2 floors above my desk became her desk. For a while, it genuinely felt like a gift. My closest friend, 2 floors up, someone I could grab lunch with on a random Tuesday without scheduling it 3 weeks out. We'd meet at the taco truck parked outside the building most Thursdays, and for the first year or so, working together only deepened what already felt like an unshakable friendship. The idea that would eventually become Nestled started the way most good ideas start, from something painful, something I didn't choose, something that simply happened to me and refused to leave me alone until I did something about it. My grandmother, Irene Kowalski, lived with early-stage dementia for the last 3 years of her life. She'd been the sharpest woman I knew, a retired schoolteacher who did the Sunday crossword in pen, who could recite half of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner from memory well into her 80s. Watching that sharpness erode, slowly and then all at once, was its own private grief, separate from the grief of eventually losing her entirely. My mother tried to manage Irene's care almost entirely alone for the first year. I watched her cycle through a rotating cast of home health aides who never stayed longer than a few months, some good, some deeply unqualified, none of them coordinated through any single system. I watched her drown in insurance paperwork that seemed engineered to be incomprehensible. Different portals for different coverage types, phone trees that dropped calls after 40 minutes on hold, prior authorization forms that contradicted each other. I watched her miss 3 full weeks of work during a single hospitalization because there was no central place, no single dashboard, where medications, appointments, aid schedules, and insurance approvals actually lived together. Everything was scattered across sticky notes, a battered spiral notebook, and my mother's increasingly exhausted memory. I watched my mother age 5 years in 18 months. And the whole time, as a product designer, I couldn't stop thinking the same thought on a loop: this is a solvable problem. Not solvable in the sense of curing dementia, nothing I could design would give my grandmother back the crossword puzzles. But solvable in the sense of taking a chaotic, fragmented, emotionally exhausting logistical nightmare and giving it structure. Solvable the way good design solves things, quietly, invisibly, by simply removing friction from someone's worst days. I started sketching what I privately called Project Irene in a Moleskine notebook I still have. Not a business plan at first, just user flows, scribbled at midnight, imagining what it would feel like if my mother had opened one app instead of 6. A single platform where families could coordinate caregivers, track medical information in one place, manage overlapping schedules across aides and doctors and pharmacies, and, this was the part one was proudest of, vet and hire background checked, reviewed freelance caregivers the way you'd book a reliable contractor through a marketplace you actually trusted. I renamed it Nestled about 4 months into development, because Project Irene felt too raw, too personal, to ever put on a slide in front of strangers. But the bones of it never changed from that first midnight sketch. I did this work almost entirely on my own time. Nights after work. Weekend mornings before Grant and Dana's brunches. I want to be specific about the record I built, because it matters enormously to everything that happens later in this story. I have a dated folder in my personal Google Drive with the earliest sketch of the Nestled concept, time-stamped 14 months before the day Dana stood up in that glass-walled conference room and called it hers. I have wireframe files in Figma with full, uneditable version history stretching back to that same period. I have a document titled, plainly, Nestled, Founding Concept, created and shared with exactly 2 people in the entire world. One of those people was my direct manager at Harlow, a thoughtful, slightly overworked product lead named Oscar Reyes, who I'd shown the idea to informally over coffee, hoping he might eventually help me pitch it internally as a possible new product line for the company. The other person was Dana. I told her on a Sunday at Colleen's, over her usual oat milk latte and my black coffee, the way you tell your best friend something you're a little afraid will sound stupid out loud. I remember the exact shape of her reaction. She set her cup down slowly, looked at me across the table, and said, "Marin, this is the best idea you've ever had. You have to do something with this." I had absolutely no idea, sitting in that chair, drinking bad coffee on an ordinary Sunday, what something would eventually come to mean. I should also tell you a little about who I was outside of work, because it matters to how I handled everything that came later. I've never been someone who processes conflict loudly. My father was an engineer, methodical to the point of being almost comic about it. He kept receipts for appliances that had been out of warranty for a decade, alphabetized his tools, and once resolved a dispute with a contractor entirely through a folder of dated photographs instead of a single raised voice. My mother used to joke that I inherited his temperament instead of hers. Where she runs hot and fast when she's wronged, I go quiet and precise. I don't yell. I collect. That's simply how I'm built, and it's the exact quality that would end up mattering more than anything else in this story. Grant, Dana's husband, used to tease me about it good-naturedly at their dinner parties. Marin doesn't get mad, he'd say, refilling wine glasses around the table. Marin gets organized. Everyone would laugh, including me. I didn't know yet how true that would turn out to be, or how much I'd eventually need it. Before I go further, let me paint you a picture of an ordinary week at Harlow Digital during that first year of Nestled's quiet development, because I think it matters to understand just how normal everything felt on the surface. My days were full of client work that had nothing to do with eldercare at all. A scheduling tool for a chain of urgent care clinics, a patient portal redesign for a hospital system in Dallas, the unglamorous, methodical grind of enterprise software design. I liked that work. I was good at it. Nestled lived entirely in the margins of my life, in the early mornings before my first meeting, in the hour after dinner before I let myself watch television, in notebook pages filled on flights and in waiting rooms. Dana's days, 2 floors up, were full of campaign calendars and brand guidelines and the kind of client-facing polish that made her genuinely excellent at her job. We were good at different things, and for a long time, I thought that was exactly why our friendship translated so well into occasional collaboration. She filled in the gaps I couldn't, and I never once felt threatened by her skill, because I never imagined she'd turn it toward taking something that wasn't hers. About 5 months after I first told Dana about Nestled, she offered to help me think through the go-to-market side of things, messaging, positioning, the kind of strategic language that had never come naturally to me. I said yes without a second thought. She was genuinely sharp at that kind of work, and honestly, it felt good to have someone this excited standing beside me instead of just cheering from a distance. We started meeting every other week, usually at her kitchen table in Circle C, going through slide after slide together. I handled the product vision, the user flows, the actual mechanics of how Nestled would function. She worked on the story, how to describe it to someone who'd never heard of it, how to make a stranger feel, in 30 seconds, why this mattered. For a while, it felt like exactly what a good collaboration should feel like. The shift, when it came, was subtle enough that I almost missed it entirely. In small internal marketing syncs I wasn't in the room for, meetings I only learned about secondhand, Dana started referring to Nestled as a concept I've been noodling on. Not technically a lie, she had, in fact, been noodling on it, at her own kitchen table, with me sitting across from her. She simply left out the part where the noodling had started somewhere else, 14 months earlier, on my kitchen counter. I found out about this specific phrasing from a coworker named Priya Patel, who mentioned it casually while we were both refilling our water bottles in the break room. "Hey, that eldercare app thing Dana's been talking about sounds really cool," Priya said. "The caregiver marketplace idea. Sounds like something you'd love, actually, given everything with your grandma." I remember the small, cold drop in my stomach, distinct and unmistakable, like missing a stair in the dark. "What exactly did she say about it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. Priya shrugged, already moving on to something else. "Just that she's been working on this idea for a while. A caregiver marketplace thing." I didn't correct her. I didn't say anything at all. I went back to my desk, and instead of confronting anyone, I did something quieter. I made a new folder on my work laptop and labeled it plainly, Nestled Documentation. I started saving everything from that point forward. Every Slack message. Every email thread. Every version of every file, each one automatically timestamped by the software itself, which meant no one, not Dana, not anyone, could later argue with the order in which things actually happened. I told myself, at the time, that I was being paranoid. I told myself Dana was my best friend, my person, the woman who'd held my shoes at my sister's wedding, and best friends simply do not do this to each other. I kept saving files anyway. There's a detail from that first collaboration phase I think about often now, in hindsight. During one of our kitchen table sessions, Dana asked me, almost offhand, whether I'd ever thought about registering the idea somehow, a trademark, a provisional filing, anything formal. I remember laughing it off at the time. "It's not that serious yet," I told her. "It's still just slides and sketches." She nodded and didn't push it, and I didn't think about that conversation again until much later, when I realized she'd been the one to plant, unintentionally or not, the exact seed of caution that eventually led me to file the IP disclosure with legal 8 months before demo day. I've never been sure whether her question came from genuine strategic thinking or from something else entirely. I've simply learned not to assume I'll ever know the difference. Incident 2, the newsletter. 3 months after that conversation with Priya, Harlow Digital's internal company newsletter, a monthly email sent out to all 60-some employees, highlighting projects, wins, and what leadership liked to call innovation spotlights, ran a feature with the headline, "Meet the idea behind Nestled, Dana Whitfield's vision for modern eldercare." I read it standing at the coffee machine on the 3rd floor, my mug half filled, the machine still gurgling behind me. My hands, I remember distinctly, were completely steady. That surprised me even in the moment. Some part of me, I think, had already been quietly bracing for this for weeks without ever fully admitting it to myself. The article quoted Dana describing the spark behind the idea, a story, almost word for word, about watching a family member struggle to coordinate fragmented eldercare across too many disconnected systems. She never used my grandmother's name. She didn't need to. She used the shape of my grandmother's story, the exact contours of my mother's exhaustion, and wore it like a coat that had never actually been cut to fit her. I didn't confront Dana that day. Instead, I walked back to my desk, opened the Nestled documentation folder, took a clean screenshot of the newsletter, and saved it, time-stamped, alongside everything else. Later that week, at our regular Sunday at Colleen's, I brought it up as gently as I could manage. "Hey," I said, turning my cup slowly on the table, "I saw the newsletter piece about Nestled. I wasn't really expecting to see the whole thing described as just your idea." Dana didn't flinch. She barely looked up from her latte. "Oh, I know, right? Corporate comms always flattens everything into some neat single founder story. It's just how those pieces get written. It's not that deep, Marin. You know I always give you credit when it actually matters." I let it go. "I want to be completely honest with you about that, because it's important to the shape of this story. I let it go because I loved her. Because 11 years is not a small number of years. Because some stubborn, hopeful part of me still believed she would correct course on her own, without my having to force the issue." Incident 3, the exclusion. 2 months after the newsletter ran, Harlow's leadership announced they were forming a small internal task force to formally evaluate Nestled as a potential spin-off product, with the real possibility of pursuing outside investment down the line. This was, in a strange way, the exact moment I had been quietly hoping for since that first midnight sketch in my Moleskine, the moment the idea might actually become something real, something with resources and a real team behind it. I was not invited to the first task force meeting. Dana was. "I found out the way you find out about most quiet betrayals at a company, by accident, scanning a shared calendar for an unrelated reason, and stopping cold on a meeting titled Nestled Strategy Sync. Attendees, Dana Whitfield. Oscar Reyes. Our CEO, Bill Harlow. 2 others from finance and legal." My name appeared nowhere on the invite list. I went to Oscar directly, my own manager, and asked him, as evenly as I could manage, why I hadn't been included in a strategy meeting for a product I had personally designed from its very first sketch. Oscar looked genuinely uncomfortable, shifting in his chair. "Honestly, Marin, Dana's been the one driving the narrative on this with leadership for a while now. I guess I assumed you two were coordinating on it together, given how close you are." "We are not," I said. It was the first time I'd said it out loud to anyone, plainly, without softening it. "We are not coordinating. This is not shared ownership, quietly divided between 2 friends. This is mine, and it is being taken from me in small, careful, deniable pieces, each one too minor on its own to justify the scene I still didn't want to make. To his credit, Oscar didn't try to explain away what had happened, or suggest I was overreacting to a simple miscommunication. "I'll fix it," he said simply, already opening his laptop to send the updated invite. "And Marin, for what it's worth, I did think this whole thing started with you." I should have said that more clearly, sooner, to the people who needed to hear it. It wasn't a full solution, but it was an honest one, and honest, by that point, was worth more to me than almost anything else anyone could have offered. Oscar added me to the next meeting without further argument. But something had already shifted in the room's collective understanding of whose idea this actually was, and I understood, sitting there afterward at my own desk, that a quiet correction from Oscar alone wasn't going to be enough to undo it. Perception had already tilted, gradually, in Dana's favor, one newsletter, one closed-door meeting, one casual mention in the break room at a time. When I did attend that second strategy meeting, I noticed something that stayed with me for a long time afterward. Dana ran the conversation. She fielded questions about the product roadmap, questions about caregiver vetting logic, about the insurance integration I'd spent 4 months researching, about edge cases in the scheduling algorithm. And she answered nearly all of them correctly, because she'd absorbed enough of my own explanations over our kitchen table sessions to sound fluent in my own thinking. It was strange, sitting there, watching someone perform expertise built entirely out of borrowed knowledge, using words I recognized as my own, restructured just enough to sound like they belonged to her. At one point, our CFO, a quiet man named Walter Sims, turned to me directly and asked, "Marin, from a design standpoint, does the timeline Dana's proposing feel realistic to you?" I answered the question professionally, the way I would have answered it regardless of everything else happening beneath the surface. But I remember thinking, very clearly, in that moment, he asked me the technical question. He asked her the story. And somehow, in this company, the story was starting to matter more than the person who'd actually lived it. That night, I didn't cry, and I didn't call Dana. Instead, I sat down at my kitchen counter, the same counter where Nestled had begun, and I built a full timeline. Every dated file, laid out in order. Every early sketch. Every Slack message where Dana had once, unprompted, called it your idea, Marin, set against every later message where she'd started quietly referring to it as her own. I organized all of it the way I would organize a design system for a client, cleanly, logically, so that anyone encountering it for the first time could understand the entire true story in under 10 minutes. I did not build that timeline out of spite. I built it because I finally, fully understood that I was going to need it. Incident 4, the meeting I wasn't supposed to hear. About a month after Oscar added me back into the strategy meetings, I stayed late one Thursday finishing a set of screen mock-ups. The office mostly emptied out around me except for the low hum of the HVAC and one conference room down the hall with its door left slightly ajar. I heard Dana's voice before I registered whose meeting it was. She was on a call with someone from Larkspur Capital, an early, informal conversation ahead of the official demo day pitch, the kind of pre-meeting meeting that happens quietly before anything becomes official. It really started as a personal thing for me, I heard her say, her voice warm and unhurried in the particular way she used when she wanted to sound sincere. Watching someone I love struggle through the caregiving system, feeling like there was no single place to hold it all together. That's really where Nestled came from. I stood very still in the hallway, my mock-up still open on my laptop screen, light spilling out from the cracked door onto the carpet. I didn't walk in. I didn't need to. I'd already heard everything I needed to hear. I went back to my desk, opened the documentation folder, and added a short, dated note to my own private timeline. Overheard DW describing Nestled's origin story as personal/hers to Larkspur pre-call, date. No prior context given about original design work. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply accurate, which, by that point, was exactly the kind of ammunition I understood I needed most. Incident 5, the demo day invitation. 6 weeks before the moment I described at the very start of this story, Harlow Digital officially announced that Nestled had been selected to present at their annual Investor Demo Day, a real pitch, in front of real venture capital firms, with real funding on the table if it landed the way leadership hoped. Oscar told me, somewhat awkwardly, that I would be attending as supporting design staff, while Dana would deliver the actual pitch as product lead. I sat with that sentence for a long time after he left my desk. Product lead. A title Dana had never formally held on any product, for an idea that had begun on my kitchen counter at 11 o'clock at night, next to a mug of cold tea and a worn photograph of my grandmother tucked into the corner of my monitor. I didn't argue with Oscar. I didn't call Dana and scream into the phone, though I understand completely why some of you watching this might have expected exactly that reaction from me by this point in the story. That has simply never been who I am. By that stage, I didn't need to argue. I needed to prepare, carefully and completely, for whatever was coming. I spent those 6 weeks doing 2 things in parallel. First, I kept doing my actual job. I kept refining the product itself, kept polishing flows and fixing edge cases, because whatever ultimately happened with credit, I still believed completely in what Nestled could become for families like mine. Second, and quietly, I finished something else entirely, a single, clean PDF, built with the same care I'd put into every other piece of this project. Every time-stamped file, in order. Every early sketch. Every message where Dana had once, in her own words, called it your idea. And beneath all of it, an IP disclosure I had filed with Harlow's own legal department 8 months earlier, naming myself formally as the original creator of the Nestled concept, something I'd done, at the time, not out of any specific suspicion of Dana, but because a friend from a previous job had once told me, offhandedly, over drinks, always paper trail your own ideas at work. Doesn't matter who you trust. Paper doesn't change its story later. That single piece of advice, from someone I barely keep in touch with anymore, turned out to be the exact reason I didn't lose everything I'd built. I printed nothing dramatic. I planned no speech, no scene. I simply made sure that if the moment came and some quiet, steady part of me already knew it would, I would be ready to answer one question completely and calmly. Whose idea was this, really? Incident 6, my mother's advice. About 2 weeks before demo day, I drove out to my mother's house in Round Rock for Sunday dinner, something I did less often than I should have, given everything going on at work. I told her, over pot roast, most of what had been happening, the newsletter, the strategy meeting I'd been excluded from, the overheard phone call outside the conference room. My mother set down her fork and looked at me for a long moment. She's not a woman who minces words. Irene would be furious, she said, meaning my grandmother. But you're not going to march in there and make a scene, are you? That's not you. It was never you. No, I admitted. I don't think I am. Good, she said. Your father used to say the loudest person in the room usually loses the argument they're having in their own head. The quiet one usually wins the one that actually matters. She reached over and squeezed my hand. You built this thing to help families like ours, Marin. Don't let it get buried under someone else's ego. But don't burn yourself down proving a point either. Just show them what's true, and let the truth do the work. I thought about that conversation more than almost anything else in the weeks that followed. It was, in a strange way, the closest thing I had to a plan, not a script, not a speech, just a quiet commitment to let the documentation speak for itself when the moment finally arrived. I also considered, more than once, simply confronting Dana privately before demo day, sitting her down at Colleen's and telling her plainly what I knew, giving her the chance to correct the record herself before it ever reached a room full of investors. I drafted a text message twice and deleted it both times. Part of me still hoped, foolishly perhaps, that she would find her own way back to honesty without my having to force it. She didn't. And by the time I stopped waiting for that to happen, demo day was only a few days away. There was one more small moment during that stretch that I still think about. For days before demo day, Dana texted me out of nowhere, excited for Friday. "We make a good team, you know that, right?" I stared at that message for a long time on my kitchen counter, the same counter where all of this had started, and I felt something in me settle into a kind of quiet, sad clarity. She wasn't being cruel. I don't believe, even now, that Dana set out that day at Colleen's 11 years ago, or even the day she first offered to help with go-to-market strategy, to steal something from me. I think she talked herself into a smaller and smaller lie, one comfortable inch at a time, until the distance between what she'd done and what she believed about herself had grown too wide to cross back over without help. I typed back a single word, excited. Because I still hadn't decided, even then, exactly how the truth was going to come out. I only knew, with total certainty, that it would. The morning of demo day, I dressed carefully, the way you dress for a funeral or a courtroom, something in between mourning and preparation. I sat in the third row of that glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of the Frost Bank Tower, my laptop closed in my lap, its lid still warm from the files I'd reviewed one final time on the drive over. Dana took the stage in a navy blazer I recognized instantly, because we'd shopped for it together 2 summers earlier at a boutique on South Congress, laughing about whether it made her look too corporate for a marketing job. "Nestled was born from a simple question," she said, her voice smooth as poured concrete, exactly as confident as I'd known it would be. "What if caring for aging parents didn't have to feel like a second job?" She clicked through slide after slide of my work. My wireframes, redrawn slightly by whoever handled the deck's final polish, but unmistakably, structurally mine. My color system, the soft sage green I'd chosen specifically because it reminded me of my grandmother's kitchen curtains. My user flows, my onboarding sequence, my empty state illustrations. When she reached the origin story, she told a version of my grandmother's story, describing watching someone I love struggle to coordinate fragmented care, without ever naming a single person, without ever once naming me. Priscilla on from Larkspur Capital raised her hand near the end of the pitch, her tone genuinely curious rather than skeptical. "This is honestly one of the strongest concepts we've seen this cycle," she said. "Dana, how long have you personally been developing this?" Dana smiled, the same warm, effortless smile I'd seen across 100 dinners, 100 slow Sunday coffees. "About 1.5 years now," she said. "It started as something I was just sketching on my own time, honestly, after watching someone close to me struggle through the whole caregiving mess." That was the line. That was the exact, precise moment. My best friend pitched my idea as her own to the investors, in a room full of people about to hand her, and by extension, Harlow Digital, several $1 million, based on a story that simply was not true. I raised my hand. Bill Harlow, our CEO, looked mildly surprised. I wasn't listed on the agenda to speak, but nodded at me anyway, gesturing for me to go ahead. "Marin, did you have something to add on the design side?" I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I did not shake, though I fully expected I might. "I do," I said. "I think it's important, for due diligence purposes, that the origin timeline of this concept is fully accurate before any funding decisions move forward." The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet right before everyone senses something is about to become genuinely interesting. "I have a file I'd like to share," I said, "if that's all right." Bill glanced toward Dana, a small, questioning flicker crossing his face. Dana's smile had gone very still, the way a lake goes still in the seconds right before weather changes it. "Of course," Bill said. "Go ahead." I connected my laptop to the display. Dana's polished deck disappeared from the screen, replaced by a single, clean PDF, formatted simply, with a chronological timeline running down the left side. "This is a document I filed with Harlow's legal department 8 months ago," I said, disclosing my original authorship of the Nestled concept, along with dated working files going back 14 months, well before Dana and I ever began collaborating on it together. I clicked to the next page. A screenshot of a Slack message, timestamped clearly at the top, sent by Dana herself, 16 months earlier. Marin, this is the best idea you've ever had. You have to do something with this. I clicked again. My earliest Figma file, its full, uneditable version history displayed alongside it, dated a full 5 months before the very first meeting at Dana's kitchen table. I clicked once more. The internal company newsletter, side by side with my own documentation folder's earliest saved draft of the very same origin story, the one about my grandmother, dated 11 months before that newsletter had ever run. I want to be clear, I said, my voice steady in a way that still surprised me, that I don't think this room needs a dramatic scene. I think it needs accurate information before anyone commits capital. Nestled is a genuinely strong product. I believe in it completely. I built it. I've simply been its original designer and sole author of the concept since long before Dana and I ever began working on it together, and I think that fact belongs in this pitch. Nobody spoke for a long moment. I could hear the faint hum of the building's HVAC system, the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below, the particular silence of a room full of people recalculating something in real time. Another investor, a man I didn't recognize from a firm called Meridian Growth Partners, leaned over and murmured something to the colleague beside him, both of them glancing between the screen and Dana with new, appraising expressions. Priscilla looked down at the notes on her phone, then back up at me, something recalibrating behind her eyes. Thank you for that clarity, she said finally. That does change how we'd want to structure this conversation going forward. Bill Harlow stood up slowly from his seat near the front. His voice, when he spoke, was measured, though I could hear something tight underneath it. I think we need to pause here, he said, and make sure everyone in this room has an accurate picture before we go any further. Marin, would you be willing to speak briefly to the actual origin and development timeline of Nestled, from your perspective? I hadn't expected to be asked outright, but I'd prepared for exactly this possibility anyway. Of course, I said, and for the next several minutes, I walked the room, calmly and without embellishment, through 14 months of work. The sketches, the research into eldercare logistics, the specific insurance integration problem I'd solved after weeks of dead ends, the reason the color palette was the particular shade of sage green it was. I didn't mention my grandmother's name. I didn't need melodrama. I simply told them what was true, in the order it had actually happened, and let the timeline on the screen behind me confirm every word. Dana said nothing at all. For the first time in 11 years, I watched her run out of words entirely. Bill cleared his throat and addressed the room. I think it's fair to say we need a short recess before continuing this conversation, he said. Thank you both. The investors filed out into the hallway in 2s and 3s, murmuring to each other in the particular low tone people use when they've just watched something they weren't sure they were supposed to see. Priscilla lingered behind. She walked over to where I was still standing beside my laptop, closing the lid slowly. Can I ask you something? She said. Off the record. Sure. Why didn't you say anything before today? You clearly had all of this ready to go. I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I kept hoping I wouldn't have to, I said. I kept hoping she'd corrected herself. I wasn't trying to catch her. I was trying to protect something I built, and I only pulled it out because the alternative was letting a false story become the permanent record. Priscilla nodded slowly, like that answer confirmed something she'd already started to suspect. That's a better answer than most founders give me about anything, she said, and walked off toward the elevators. Dana was still standing at the front of the room when I looked back at her. She hadn't moved. Her blazer, the one we'd shopped for together, suddenly looked like it belonged to someone else entirely. What happened over the following 2 weeks unfolded quietly, in exactly the way I'd built the case for it, no shouting, no public unraveling in front of an audience, just the slow, orderly correction of a record that had been wrong for well over a year. Bill Harlow called me into his office the next morning. He didn't apologize with a great many words, which I respected more than I expected to. He simply said, "I should have asked more questions before all of this. What do you need from me to make this right?" I want to pause here and say something about that drive home the night before, because it's the moment that has stayed with me most clearly out of everything in this story. I sat in my car in the parking garage beneath the Frost Bank Tower for almost 20 minutes before I could bring myself to start the engine. Not because I was upset, I was, oddly, calmer than I'd expected to be. I sat there because I was trying to figure out what I actually wanted the outcome to look like, now that the truth was finally, undeniably out in the open. It would have been easy, in that moment, to want something punitive. Some part of me, if I'm honest, wanted Dana to lose everything the way I'd nearly lost my claim to the thing I'd built out of my own grief. But sitting there in the quiet of that parking garage, I realized what I actually wanted wasn't revenge. I wanted my name on my own work. I wanted the product to survive, because I still believed in what it could do for families like mine. And I wanted, if I was being completely honest with myself, for Dana to understand what she'd actually done, not through humiliation, but through the plain, undeniable weight of the truth. By the time I turned the key in the ignition, I had my answer, and it was exactly what I told Bill the next morning. I told him exactly what I needed, having already thought it through carefully during that drive home the night before. Formal, written recognition as Nestled's founding designer and original product concept author, documented in any future funding materials going forward. A direct conversation with Priscilla On's firm to clarify the record fully, since preliminary term sheet discussions had already begun based on information that wasn't accurate. And a real, named role in whatever came next. Not supporting design staff, but product lead, the exact title that had quietly been handed to someone else 6 weeks earlier without my knowledge. Bill agreed to all three within the hour, no negotiation required. He also asked, near the end of that conversation, whether I wanted to file any kind of formal internal complaint against Dana through HR, a route that would have created a permanent, official record of misconduct on her employment file. I thought about it for a moment and told him no. Not out of any lingering loyalty to Dana, but because it wasn't the kind of justice I was after. I didn't need Dana punished by a system. I needed the truth restored to its proper place, and once that happened, everything else, I found, took care of itself far more naturally than any formal complaint could have managed. Word of what happened in that conference room spread through Harlow Digital the way these things always do. Not through any announcement, but through the ordinary, quiet churn of office conversation. I never once discussed the details with anyone beyond what was necessary. I didn't need to. The story, once it was true, told itself. Dana didn't call me that night. She texted once, close to midnight, "Can we talk?" I didn't answer right away. When I finally did, 3 days later, I agreed to meet her at Colleen's. The same mismatched chairs, the same chalkboard menu that never changed, 11 years of ordinary Sundays sitting quietly behind us in that small, sun-warmed room. She looked smaller than I remembered her looking on that stage, her shoulders drawn in, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup she didn't drink from. "I didn't think it would actually go that far," she said. I told myself I was just representing the idea. Since I was the one presenting it. "You told a room full of investors it was yours," I said, keeping my voice level. "Not once. Multiple times, over more than a year. A newsletter. A meeting I wasn't invited to. A stage, in front of people about to decide whether to fund my work." She didn't argue. I think, by that point, some part of her finally understood there was nothing left worth arguing. I hadn't come to that table with anger. I'd come with a folder, and folders, unlike people, don't quietly change their story later to make themselves more comfortable. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't end our friendship," I told her, and I meant it as gently as the words could carry. "But I want you to understand something clearly. I would have shared credit with you. I offered to, more than once, in ways you never even knew about, because I was already documenting things by then and I still hoped, honestly hoped, that you'd correct course on your own before it ever got to this point. What I couldn't do, what I was never going to do, was let you have authorship of something that was never yours to claim. Dana left the company 6 weeks later. Not fired, technically, in any formal sense. But the trust required to lead a product she no longer had any real, honest claim to had simply evaporated entirely, and there was, functionally, nowhere left for her at Harlow that made sense for either of us. Larkspur Capital moved forward with funding nestled anyway, restructured this time around an accurate story, with my name attached to the founding documentation and a product lead title that was, for the first time in this whole story, actually true. The final irony, if you want to call it that, arrived about 4 months later, at a smaller industry mixer downtown, held in a converted warehouse space near the river. Priscilla found me near the drink table and said, without much preamble, over the low hum of conversation around us, you know, the moment that actually convinced us wasn't the polished pitch on that stage. It was you, standing up with a single folder, telling the truth calmly in front of everyone who mattered. That's the exact moment we decided we could actually trust this team long-term. Dana had spent a year and a half building a story carefully designed to impress a room full of strangers. I had spent that same year and a half simply keeping an honest, dated record of what was already true. In the end, it turned out the truth was the better pitch all along. Nestled launched publicly 9 months later, in the spring, with a small press write-up in a regional business journal that used, almost word for word, the story I'd told in that conference room, a designer who built something out of her own family's exhaustion, and kept the receipts to prove it. My mother cut the article out and put it on her refrigerator, next to a photograph of my grandmother from a Christmas 20 years earlier, the two of them side by side under a magnet shaped like a bluebonnet. Oscar took me to lunch a few weeks after the launch, at a barbecue place near the office we'd always meant to try and never had. I owe you an apology I don't think I ever said properly, he told me, over a plate of brisket neither of us finished. I should have asked more questions the moment I saw that first calendar invite without your name on it. I got comfortable assuming things were fine because it was easier than asking. You added me back the second I asked, I said. That counts for something. It shouldn't have taken you asking, he said, and I appreciated that he didn't try to make it smaller than it was. I ran into Grant once, months later, at a grocery store on Anderson Lane, both of us reaching for the same brand of coffee. He looked genuinely uncomfortable, the way people look when they're caught between two versions of loyalty. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I told her from the beginning that what she was doing wasn't right. I don't think she ever really believed she'd get caught. I don't think she ever thought about what happens after, if she did. I told him I appreciated him saying so, and I meant it, though it changed very little about where things stood between any of us by then. Dana and I have not spoken since that afternoon at Colleen's. I heard, secondhand, through people who still move in both our circles, that she eventually left Austin for a marketing role in Denver. I don't wish her harm. I simply understand, more clearly now than I did before any of this happened, that some friendships end not because love disappears all at once, but because trust, once it's been spent carelessly enough times, doesn't renew itself just because you miss the person who spent it. I still go to Colleen's most Sundays, though I go alone now, or occasionally with Priya, who's become a good friend in her own right since all of this happened. The chairs are still mismatched. The chalkboard menu still hasn't changed. Sometimes I sit at the same table Dana and I used to share, and I think about 11 years of ordinary mornings, and I let myself feel the loss of that without pretending it doesn't still ache sometimes. Grief for a friendship isn't so different, I've learned, from grief for a person. It just asks less of the people around you, and offers fewer rituals to help you carry it. I think about that whole year and a half often, especially now, watching Nestled grow into something that genuinely helps families navigate the exact chaos my mother once drowned in alone. We've onboarded over 400 vetted caregivers across 3 states as of this recording. I still get emails, every so often, from people I've never met, thanking the team for building something that made an impossible season of their lives even slightly more bearable. I forward every single one of those emails to my mother. She still has that refrigerator article, a little sun-faded now, still hanging next to the photograph of her and my grandmother under the bluebonnet magnet. Sometimes people ask me, when they hear this story secondhand, whether I regret not confronting Dana sooner, whether things might have turned out differently if I'd said something the moment I first heard my own words in someone else's mouth. I don't think so, honestly. I think if I'd confronted her early, without proof, it would have become a matter of my word against hers, two friends arguing over the ownership of a feeling instead of a documented fact. The waiting wasn't weakness. It was the slow, unglamorous work of making sure that when the truth finally did come out, no one in that room would have any reasonable way to doubt it. Here's what I took from all of it. People who quietly take credit for your work are usually counting on two things: your silence and your inability to prove otherwise. Don't give them either. You don't have to be loud to be undeniable. Document your work, protect your name, and trust that the truth, laid out calmly and completely, will always outlast someone else's performance of it. That's my story. My best friend pitched my idea to investors as her own, and I had the files to prove it wasn't. If this one hit home for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in that room, and hit subscribe if you want more stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.